They say that everyone knows the best way to prime MDF terrain is with a Rattlecan, because MDF is water absorbent and lacquers fill in better. But what if you live in an apartment or other space that is not conducive to Rattlecan spraying? Like me. Will primers fill in all that precision laser etched detail? Are your water-based paints going to warp the material of those miniature buildings and barricades? What if we sealed the MDF first in a matte or gloss clear coat? Or does any of this nonsense matter at all? Today we're going to find out, because not only am I new to MDF terrain, but I, ironically, have quite a bit of it buried in the pile of opportunity. And also I like to share. Welcome to Tabletop Alchemy, where we're not embarrassed to be noobs and try out new things. I'm Ignatius, and you're you, and we're in this tabletop journey together. So, as I said, I'm new to the whole laser cut MDF terrain scene. There's a ton of it out there, and a few years ago I imported some rather large collections of MDF terrain kits from England and Australia, specifically from TT Combat and Knights of Dice. And on top of that, I've already built all the kits. That's right. Mostly while watching season 2 of Critical Role. Yeah, I've had these things for a while. Anyway, the point here is that I have a ton of miniature buildings to paint up, and I've never painted a lick of MDF. I've chosen the most basic, simple, almost throwaway model I have in my collection to run today's tests on. Actually, this entire video production is a test for me. I've never produced a work desk / tutorial type of video before, and the process definitely has a learning curve to it. So I've tried my best, and I've learned quite a bit about the actual shooting side of things, so hopefully in the future I'll get better at making this type of content. That all said, when looking at this MDF terrain, the first thing I noticed is how fine the detail is on these things. I was kind of worried that primer and paint might fill in all this stuff, and I've heard from various sources online that detail could in fact be lost depending on the type of paint or primer you use. The MDF itself has a tooth to it that creates this subtle texture, and I didn't know what to expect putting paint over that either. Real quick, for those of you that want to know, MDF stands for medium density fiberboard. It's made by breaking down hard or soft wood into fine particles and then recombining those particles with wax and a resin binder to create a workable end material. Terrain kits are made out of pretty thin sheets of this stuff, thin enough that prosumer grade lasers can cut right through it and also etch in all those tiny details. And the details are actually really cool, and I definitely didn't want to lose any of that if possible. I glued up my kits with wood glue, and as you can see, the parts don't always go together as easily as you'd hope, and I didn't always take the time to be super precise. You could put a lot of work into these kits to make really tight finished display pieces out of them, like sanding and filling the flat dovetail joints, etc. But really, we're tabletop hobbyists. Who's got time for that? We want to roll some dice. All right, enough of my excuses, let's get on with it. Keep in mind, this is just a series of tests, and I'm not finishing the model up for this video. We just want to see how the different primer techniques work. I'll most likely repaint this entire model at some point to actually finish it up. I want to try out 5 techniques. 1. Airbrushing acrylic primer. Here I'm going to use Stynylrez Gray, because that's what I got. I like this primer. I haven't tried Vallejo or Pro Acryl or some of the other brands. Maybe I'll try something new after I use all this stuff up. 2. Airbrushing matte varnish followed by primer. Here I'll use Vallejo's Mecha Flat Varnish. I seal my minis with this stuff all the time. 3. Airbrushing gloss varnish followed by matte varnish followed by primer. I'm sure this sounds ridiculous. The idea with this one is that gloss varnish is typically much more durable and protective than matte varnish, and I'm wondering if it might seal the MDF better than just matte varnish on its own. The matte will go over the gloss to bring back some tooth for the primer to bite into. 4. Hand painting on a coat of Modpodge and paint mix. I'm planning to use acrylic inks to tint the Modpodge. Spoiler, that doesn't go well. So I end up using, well, you'll see. And 5. Just airbrushing paint right onto the MDF. I'm using one of the cheapest airbrushes available, the classic $30 Masters G233, because that's the only airbrush I own. And I use it for 2 things: priming miniatures and clear coating them after they're painted. Here's an interesting detail about that airbrush. Apparently, Iwata failed to protect its patent on its general internal airbrush design at some point, and so this brush right here is almost an identical copy of the Iwata HPC. Now, its parts quality and machining are almost definitely not up to par with an Iwata's, but still, I think that's pretty funny. Anyway, this brush is what I call a beater. You can push a lot of crap through it, and if it jams up beyond repair, just order a new one. All that said, I do clean this thing after each use, and it's worked fine for me for years. I've only ever used the largest needle for paint volume, but one day I want to try the smaller needles and see if this thing can actually do any kind of detail work. And that said, let me declare, I am not savvy with airbrush work. Dumping primer on a model is one thing. Doing actual artistic paintwork with an airbrush is definitely another. All right, first thing I did was label each wall with the technique I planned to use on it so I could keep track after the primer and paint went on. I started out with the gloss varnish since it's the lowest level of application. I use a bit of airbrush thinner and flow improver with the clear varnishes. It just seems to help stop clogging in the brush. I just use a bit. I don't thin the varnish nearly as much as I would actual paint. After cleaning the gloss out of the brush, I gave the gloss coat a bit of time to dry, and then I put down the matte coat over the gloss and over the raw MDF on this face of the building. Then it was time for the gray primer, and I was instantly surprised by what happened. It seemed to highlight the surface details really well. It didn't seem to fill in anything. The MDF does seem to soak up a bit of the primer, but nothing like I was led to believe was going to happen. I sprayed a pretty liberal amount of primer just to see what it did. To be honest, the primer going right over the MDF itself seems to work great. So onto the Modpodge. And as you could see, the acrylic inks reacted weird. It's like the inks congealed into colored sand or something. My inks are fairly old, I guess. I mean, I don't know what qualifies as old for artist inks. They're a few years old for sure. But as you can see here, I put some on the paper just to see if there were chunks or anything, but it looked fine. It's just the Modpodge looks like cream of wheat cereal or something. So craft paint to the rescue. This is typically what I put into the Modpodge for base coating terrain foam pieces. I just thought the inks would be cool to use. Apparently not. Anyway, I slapped the tinted Modpodge down kind of like normal, maybe a little thinner than I would have on foam pieces, but I just wanted to see what it would do to the detail etched into the MDF. As you can see, the Modpodge is not great at going on smooth, which is typically fine for rougher organic ground type terrain. All right, let's look at the base coat results. The Modpodge dried as expected, a little bit gloopy, got some nice runs in there, has that kind of smooth sealed finish. Not sure what it's done to the details yet, we'll see with paint on top of it. The straight primer side looks awesome. The MDF still has a relatively rough texture, but in scale it's actually very fine. The details are sharp and there doesn't seem to be any filling of the etched lines anywhere. The lines in the roof are particularly shallow, but they show up with no problem. Now the side with matte varnish under the primer looks a tiny bit rougher, but it's barely perceptible. It does feel hardier, I guess is the word. Visually, it just seems to have a bit more of that micro stucco look. Again, barely perceptible. The double varnished side with gloss under the matte coat and primer on top has an even more pronounced micro stucco look and feel. But again, this isn't something that's going to be noticeable on the tabletop at all. It's very subtle, but it is there. Still, all that said, the details remain crisp. Okay, now for some paint. I'm trying out a line I've never used before, some Army Painter airbrush paints. I don't like regular Army Painter paints, but I do like their washes. Of course, right? But this brand of airbrush paints is probably the most economical line of airbrush paints on the market. I got a small selection of colors I thought I'd make use of in terrain painting. I started out using a fairly dark brown, but it ended up being very close to the primer color, so I switched to a lighter brown for better contrast. So we can actually see the paint going on. Side note about airbrush paints, I understand that these are just convenience purchases. Obviously, you can thin down any paint and shove it through an airbrush. But we all like to try out new tools and paints and whatever else we can spend our hard-earned ducats on in this hobby. It's an affliction. Leave us alone. You can see my expert airbrushing skills on full display here. Those overcharged air pressure splatters are completely intentional and artfully placed. Don't argue with the artist. Now, just to see what it's like, I thought I'd slap some craft paint over the roof since that's the typical technique I use for sort of basing organic terrain features. Just mixing some in here and there, a bit of streaking to discolor the roof, maybe go for a mossy sort of thing. Simple, fast, and definitely not how I would approach an actual terrain piece like this. Rough, slapdash organic techniques like this can totally work if you're a better artist than I. But I can already tell I'm going to want to do some full-on paint jobs on these buildings, using the airbrush for the base coats, and then of course some actual try-hard dry brushing, as opposed to this nonsense you see here, where I'm just knocking paint around to see what the MDF is like. The texture is so fine on this model that haphazard dry brushing like this isn't going to pick out a lot of detail because the detail just isn't pronounced enough for that kind of thing. Oh yeah, here's putting some paint directly on the MDF. And to be honest, it seems to work just fine. I think I've said fine a lot in this video and it's starting to bother me. The material does soak up a bit of paint, so 2 or 3 coats are probably necessary, but in the end, this could work just fine. Good Lord. I imagine for myself though, I'll be going with the primer coat and then matte sealing a completed paint job. Probably with gloss and then matte over that. To really kick in the durability of terrain like this, I would prefer to hard coat the pieces with industrial Rattlecan varnish, because those products are typically much stronger than this hobby acrylic stuff. But as I mentioned, I'm just not in a place where I can easily make use of Rattlecans. You ever spray lacquer in your apartment? Yeah, that's a mistake. Alright, so the overall end results and my opinions on these tests. TLDR, which I guess should have gone at the beginning so you didn't have to skip through this entire video. Alright, TLDR, my favorite technique and the one I'll go with in the future is just laying down primer and then paint with an airbrush. Weathering, washes, and details can go on with regular brushes after that. The sides with the matte and the gloss plus matte undercoats do seem to be a tick harder. They feel a bit more solid or protected. That's to be expected, but I don't think the time and expense of laying down those sealing layers is really worth it in the long run. The paint and primer coat seems hardy enough and nothing rubs off when I give it a good scrub. All in all, this has been a pretty worthwhile experiment for me. Now I know what the details will look like after paint, which was the thing I was most interested in. And I'm actually surprised at how well the details hold up. Even with that thick-ass Modpodge, the details are still mostly there. Well, that wraps it up. For me, a success. For you, probably a boring video that needed the TLDR at the beginning and not the end. But hopefully, and if you live in a space where you can't Rattlecan and you've got a cheap airbrush and you haven't worked with MDF terrain kits before, that's a lot of caveats, maybe this information has helped a little bit. These terrain kits are actually really cool. This one is very, very simple in detail. I've got plenty of others that are really nice. All right, well, go paint something. See ya.